My name is Christina Cacouris. I'm a writer and researcher, and I'm here today on behalf of Muse Collection, which represents the estate of Deborah Turbeville. I'm delighted to be sitting here with Nathalie Herschdorfer, the director of the Photo Elysée, who is going to be curating a wonderful show about Deborah Turbeville. So we'll be talking about her work today. So one of the first things I wanted to start off with is, over the last few years, as we've been working on this archive and meeting all kinds of people that are interested in her work, it's been so interesting to hear stories of people's first encounters with her work, their first impressions. So I'd love to hear, what was the first work of Deborah Turbeville's that you came across, and what impacted you about her work?
Well, I guess like many people, the work for me that was always very important, thinking about her, was this series she made in 1975, published in Vogue, US, The Bath House. This is really part of history of photography, and my background is history of photography. So my approach to her was through this series, and I worked on a large project some years ago, 10 years ago, about a history of fashion photography, but from a photography perspective. And because I was writing about history of fashion photography, of course I couldn't do without her, 1975, this moment where she published this story in Vogue. In the same Vogue issue, there was Helmut Newton, Richard Avedon. So certainly she was among these, stars. Also, I was always interested in, female photographers. So for me, I wanted to understand, knowing about her, how she started as a photographer and also as a woman. And I came to this series that really made her name everywhere.
So let's talk about Bath House a little bit, because I think that was so many people's introduction to her work, and it certainly had a domino effect within fashion photography. Something that really struck me as we were researching more about that image is that it originally was scheduled to be shot in Peru, but there was a coup the month that they were supposed to fly out and shoot it. So the location that they went to, the Asser-Levy bathhouses, was a very last-minute choice. So it's interesting to see this tie-in with politics and fashion, how this political coup ended up creating this ripple effect that also changed fashion photography. This photograph was so controversial at the time, and looking at it from a modern lens, to me, I don't tend to see the same things that people were saying in the 70s. Why was that picture so controversial?
Thinking back in the 70s, fashion photography was all about, this modern life, the city, something really like, contemporary and lively. And the fact that she chose this old location, kind of abandoned style, and of course, knowing Deborah Turbevilles, and we may talk about that, she always chose kind of strange location or, things that are kind of abandoned. And this is exactly what she chose for this shooting. And I think there's a kind of, strange thing at the time to have this setting in a place that were not glamorous. And fashion photography was all about, selling glamour. And this is a story about bathing suits. So, it's a commission for a fashion magazine, one of the most important fashion magazines at the time, the American Vogue, selling bathing suits in a kind of abandoned public bath, which is nothing to do with glamorous and sun and, beautiful swimming pool. I think that was quite tricky. In her shooting, she only had these women that have this kind of, they are quite close to each other. They don't chat together, but they are still, they have these kind of strange body languages. And it seemed that when you hear about stories and what happened at that time, it seemed that people were really disturbed by also this group of women together in this public bath, but what they were doing there, like hidden place. And then there were all these, readers, it seemed, that complained about thinking that these images were kind of erotic, but pornographic maybe. And if you look at that today with our contemporary eyes, I don't see any of that. But also the fact that it is a public bath, and you see it's kind of abandoned, And then it raises this question at the time that it reminds about, history, and it was more about what happened during Second World War, and the fact that we would put Jewish people in places that they were just, put there to just be killed. And I don't know how this link was made, but the setting and the location chosen by Deborah Turbeville caused these discussions at that time. So it was a mix, I think, of different things, but the series was very disturbing for these readers. And don't forget that at the time, these readers were kind of, people who wanted to buy fashion, who wanted to have this kind of beautiful magazine that you can have on your dining room, whether you are in New York City or in Texas, you would have that, on your table, and you would show that you are really, being trendy because you follow the fashion, and then you want to, be, fashionable. And somehow for these readership, it was problematic to have such a story.
She really seemed to like these very dilapidated and eerie settings and locations. I think one of the first works that I came across of hers was the Comme des Garçons series in the early 1980s, where it looks like you have a ghost coming down the stairs. And it struck me when I saw it because up until that point in history, again, so much fashion photography seemed to be pretty girls in pretty dresses smiling, and she really changed all of that. But she did seem to be compared a lot to both Guy Bourdin and Helmut Newton. Do you think those were apt comparisons?
Yeah, I mean, she always was in this group. Why that? Because if you look at the magazine at the time, they were everywhere. And, the main fashion magazine, they would publish these guys. And so there was no so much space for other people, Irving Penn, Avedon, Guy Bourdin, Helmut Newton were these, names that you constantly saw in these important magazines. So somehow, as a female photographer, and as I said, no space really for other names, and she found a way to get many pages. I mean, I don't remember how many pages this bathhouse story is, but it wasn't a kind of hidden thing. It was really right in the middle of the magazine, and somehow the American Vogue, Alexander Lieberman at that time, the artistic director, he trusted her and he gave her work to do, and he put her in the middle of the Guy Bourdin and Helmut Newton or Irving Penn. So in that sense, she was compared to this group of photographers that were very powerful, very recognized, respected, even a little bit shocking, but still they were there and very important. And somehow she made a kind of room for herself in this context, and with her work, as you said, about this series about Comme des Garçons, very different kind of imagery, very different. You cannot compare to these other names we just mentioned. And also what is interesting, that the Bathhouse series was published in color. But my understanding today, because when I was researching about it, she shot in black and white. It wasn't color. So at that time, in the mid-70s, it was hand-colored, or they added colors. Wow. Because the magazine, of course, at that time, it was more important to have color shootings. So she insisted to shoot in black and white. She did it. But what you see in the magazine is in color. So again, it is very interesting because she had precise ideas and she wouldn't just do what people expected. And I think it's a sign of someone quite strong also in her position.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned as you were researching her work, I'm curious, when you approach a project like curating a show of her work for mostly an audience that isn't already familiar with her, and you have access to her entire body of work, where do you start and what do you then hope to show? And what surprises you when you go through that work?
Yeah, working on Deborah Turbeville, but I had the same feeling when I worked on this large project dedicated to, it was 100 years of fashion photography, so again, very large. First of all, you think about the iconic works, So for Deborah was this Bathhouse, or Comme des Garçons also was a series that was published a lot. You think first, okay, if you want to work on Irving Penn today or Avedon, you have these iconic images, coming in mind, and you expect to see them. And what is so interesting, if you go back to history of photography at a time when it wasn't digital, but it was, prints. And so you see contact sheets, or you see proper prints in boxes, and a mix of things in boxes. So you really physically open a box and just go through and look at that. If you do the same thing in digital archives, I don't think you can enter into the same way. And with Deborah Turbeville, when I discovered the archive, I was again, okay, let's see what I can find. But I had my idea about iconic works, which I like, but still. And you open a box, and you open another box, and suddenly you see something else. And you discover these treasures. And that's what happened with Deborah, but that's what happens to all of, the project I made with photographers, going through contact sheets, going into boxes and trying to see maybe something they didn't really selected or made visible. But when you have this possibility in being in an archive and just opening randomly, I would say, boxes, that's what happens.
And what were one of those special discoveries that you made this time?
Looking at her collage work. And I didn't expect that. I was more thinking about her fashion work, because that's thing that you can see in magazines. And of course, when you look at an image in a magazine, even though with Deborah I could see that there was an atmosphere, kind of, old images, like also the fact that these images are kind of, blurry images and a bit strange in the way they are manipulated. So I expected something like that, but go into the archive. What was brought to me is a body of work that she made in the 1990s called Passport, where you see images put on this brown paper, and she would cut, tear apart, put tape, pins on these images that she would find in her own archive. So some of these images were iconic images that we can see published. But they were used in different kind of sizes and put together. And then I realized that she put a lot of, care in bringing that together. I can imagine her sitting on the desk, having all these little images, scissors and tape, and trying to just focusing on that and doing something very personal. And I was very touched by this, and the project I curate and the book that will be published is really about this collage work. And because for me it was really touching about, and I could feel the persona.
Yeah, the very personal touch. She certainly wasn't a photography purist. She really didn't have any qualms about ripping up and distressing her own work. Do you look at those images and think of them as photographs then, or are they something different than a photograph? Are they more of an art object?
Well, that's always the question. Photography, is it part of art or not? And of course, thinking about fashion photography, there was always this struggle about how, in what category you would put that, commerce or art. Is it something that, because it's a commission, then it means that it's not art? That's not my belief, and that's what I tried also to say with the project I made about fashion photography going through, because for me it's beyond this commercial aspect. It's in some cases, I wouldn't say that it's true for all fashion photography, but in some cases these images have another life, and they go beyond this commercial use. But with Deborah's, what was interesting for me is this idea of the handmade. Because of course we are talking about photography at a time that was reproduced in magazine, and photography is, something that you reproduce, and this is, the strength of photography. But thinking about fashion magazine and her, because she made a career in fashion, it was always a kind of beautiful, in French we say papier glacé, you know, this beautiful printing and this, you know, the printed page. And with her, what was striking is that the handmade, the fact that it's a little bit old, that she manipulates and destroys, somehow destroy her work and try to make it kind of old. And you have this feeling that it's not something belonging to the 1970s or 1980s or 1990s. It looks like more a work published in, made in 1900. So for me, this aspect was very interesting, and the fact that you see the pins, the tape, you have the feeling that this is an artist, you know, on a desk, just focusing on that and building an artwork, and that was the magic of for me, the magic of this work.
Passport's a particularly interesting series, I think, because it revealed to all of us that she also had somewhat literary ambitions, maybe even screenwriting ambitions. We found that she had written a full manuscript to go along with it, and then some of those images have cut out bits of text so that you can actually not only visually read them, but quite literally read them as well. So it again brings back this question of, is photographer a reductive term for her if she was really involved in all these other artistic mediums?
In a way, for me, photography is a tool, is a medium, is something that for an artist you can use to create. It's about, you know, creating something. And I'm trained as an art historian, and thinking about, you know, works of different artists in the 20th century, that could be, you know, paintings, that could be drawings, but that could be also engraving. And photography is part of this tradition in that sense. It's just another medium. And if you think continue in history, then you can have video art, and this is with a camera and film. And today it's more installation, and you see many artists working with, you know, wallpaper and making sculptures with paper or whatever. I mean, what is interesting is photography is just, you know, a medium there to produce imagery. And I don't try to say that photography, because it is made with a camera, so a machine, that is less art than someone who, you know, writes or paints. I wouldn't say that. So for me, what I discovered with her work, with Deborah Turbeville work, is that she's a proper artist in the sense that she creates a kind of universe, you know, a world by herself. She has an idea about what she wants to communicate. She tries to tell us about a story she wants, and she uses tools she had. So it means paper, her photographs, because she made her life as a, you know, working as a photographer, but now we discovered that she wrote as well. So it's a mix about everything, because she's a proper artist and she has this need to create. As a creator, that's, you know, she uses everything she can have. So it's really something fascinating. It's not just working on a commission and, you know, producing images because you get a commission. It's really putting care, attention, but like many other photographers, to a work, to create an imagery, and that's what is important. But also what I want to add is, what is so important also with this discovery is these archives include everything she produced. Usually you can imagine an artist selling works to collectors or to institutions, museum, and I run a museum, and we have a collection, and you imagine in the collection of a photography museum, it means, you know, prints in boxes, clean. And when you have this access to the studio of this artist, and Muse collection has everything that she produced. It's not a selection of prints that were made for the market or made for, you know, for us to see. It's everything. And that's a joy, because then you realize that they are treasures that maybe you wouldn't imagine, or the artist wouldn't show you. And the fact that you keep everything together and you get access to these materials that were not put in the market or were not shown before. And today we see that, very differently, and we realize that there are treasures there that maybe Deborah Turbeville herself would never show before. I don't know, but it's the fact that you have the entire archives and that it's all kept together by the Muse collection, and I think that's the most important thing, that it gives you a way to discover really in depth what this artist was.
It's really an exciting moment to be able to start to share more of her work, particularly because, as we've talked about, she really didn't become the household name that perhaps she should have, like her counterparts. So it's interesting to think about why that was. I do think with a lot of artists like her that mythologizing is so central to their fame, whether it's changing their name, changing their backgrounds, and she very much cultivated an air of mystery around her. Very famously would not allow herself to be photographed much, would change her age a lot in interviews and sort of invent details about her life. Do you think that may have had a bit of an impact into why people didn't know as much about her? Did she hold back too much?
That's not my understanding, and that's not what I would say. Of course, she created a kind of enigmatic woman, but is it not the case of many photographers? Think about Irving Penn. He was quite, modest, and he wouldn't put himself in front of the camera. There are some portraits, but he was dedicated to his work, working very seriously. It's not like he was wanting to be there Helmut Newton is different because he was playing as a character also. And but that's about, I would say, personality. Today we have names in photography. Think about Tim Walker, the big name today in photography. And we live in a time where we want these names. But in the 70s, photographers, they were not so many big names. So I don't think at that time it was, a position for a photographer to say, I want to be famous and I want my name, I don't think it was part of the spirit in photography. I wouldn't say that. It was starting. There was, of course, exceptions like David Bailey, who was very well known since the 60s, but I think most of the photographers, they were not big names. And also fashion photography. In fashion photography, there was always this kind of box of you are commercial, you are not an artist. So it was also a time where fashion photography was really, put aside. And she belongs to the generation who somehow made a bridge to art. Like Helmut Newton had, but later in his life, big shows, even Irving Penn, but it was kind of late in their lives. So in that sense, she belongs to this generation who could be considered also as an artist, but maybe for her, it became even later, and that's maybe why we are doing a project today. She's a name. If you open a dictionary of photography, I think you will find her name, but it's small. You wouldn't have a kind of extensive caption for her. But it's also about being a woman. That's you have the problem of working in fashion, where you wouldn't have a career as an artist with shows because fashion was commercial. This is the problem of photography. Photography was always considered as, kind of put aside. It's not that photographers were big names. You would have Andy Warhol, but you wouldn't have, Irving Penn the same way that we recognize his name today, because it couldn't be put in the same category. So I think she really belongs to this generation. And being a woman, there were very few women at that time working actively and being able to get all this commission. It was, the art world, and I would say also the world working in magazines, I mean, it was tricky as a woman now today, 21st century, we go back to history and we have all these names, female photographers coming, but that's very, very new. So I would say that the last 10, 15 years, we are now revisiting history of art or history of photography and bringing all these female artists. And I would say that Deborah, for her, it was also something that happened to her. She was able to live and to make a living as a photographer. She got commissioned, but in a way, she wasn't as known as Helmut Newton, but she still was able to make a living. So she got work. So in that sense, I would say that it's a mix of, working in photography, being a woman, and all of that makes that she's kind of under-recognized. And this is really time to have her name more established, I would say. And this is what we have to do in museums or in with publishing books and try to kind of rewrite history of photography.
It's interesting looking at the timeline of her career, because around 1975, when Bathhouse came out, there was this big bang for her where all of a sudden she was being written about, her work was being included in a lot of exhibitions. And you would think then that it would continue this trajectory onwards and that she would have become this much bigger name. But I do find it interesting that in around that time, perhaps the late 70s or early 80s, even the New York Times was starting to refer to the Deborah Turbeville look. And I'm curious today, when you look at the photography landscape, do you see remnants of her influence on photographers today?
Yeah, I think, but in contemporary photography, I could see that people who think about more in an intimate way, photography being something quite intimate, because there's an intimacy in her work. What is interesting also that she really is a photographer in the sense that she's really much interested in, print making. Also in the fact that it seems that it's random, it seems that she doesn't pay attention and she doesn't care if the print is not, if it's a little bit yellow or blurry, but it is an intention and she intended to do that.
Right.
So in that sense, she really thinks in terms of the photographic medium and she plays with that. Today, many contemporary photographers, they go back to the medium and play with the medium and this experimental, way of dealing with prints and manipulating, or maybe today you do that with your computer, but there are also many artists going back to the dark room, and my feeling is that her work seems very contemporary in that sense, and I can see her influence somehow in the younger generation there. So yeah, I think she has a work that was a little bit put aside. We didn't realize, the impact. But if you talk to, people, photographers that studied photography and have an idea about history, they may mention Deborah Turbeville as a kind of, reference.
I think that so much of her work was really based on instinct too. As much as she was so interested in the photographic process and particularly printing, I don't think she was necessarily as technically proficient with the camera as some of her contemporaries, but I think it was very much to her advantage. Looking back really at the beginning of her career, she had done the very famous masterclass with Richard Avedon and Marvin Israel. And Richard Avedon held up her work as the best work in the class. And he said it was precisely because she wasn't very technically trained, that she had a very original point of view. So do you think that she maintained that and that's why people relate to her work so much?
Yeah, the thing is, thinking about her work, and it's also very difficult to put this work in a kind of, you cannot say, oh, she's part of this group of artists. Or at that time, all these people were working together. If you think about street photography, you would have a kind of school, And
Right.
photographers, even it's a generation of people working out, going into the street, and you have a kind of, modern eyes in the street. Or if you go back to history and you think about people educated at Bauhaus, even though they all have different careers, then you have a kind of idea of, a movement. That's what we call in art, and people, even if they don't even, put that on top of their list, it's still part of kind of education in the way they work and the way they produce photography. And with Deborah, it's completely alone. Mm-hmm. She has her own way of doing things, and thinking also about her why she was not more recognized. If she wanted to have a career and be very famous, she would maybe do what Avedon was doing. She would say, okay, I'm going to copy him and do kind of similar work. She didn't do that at all. Or if she could see other photographers working at that time and being published, she didn't try to, do similar images. Not at all. She wasn't the opposite. She was doing her own stuff, and if it wasn't published, that's fine. We have that feeling looking at her work that she was just, walking in her direction and not trying to, compromise or do stuff that people wanted to see. So it is very strong as, an artist. And maybe that's also why today she can be, be a model for many artists, younger generation.
My last question for you really is, you've spent a lot of time now in the archives researching her work. You've really immersed yourself into Deborah Turbeville's world. I'm curious how you would define it, because when I look at her work, there's a lot of different words that come to mind: melancholic, eerie, romantic sometimes. Mm-hmm. What's been the overarching feeling for you?
Photography was a way for her to write a fiction, or bring us in a kind of parallel world, more like a dreamy. It's like being in cinema, where suddenly you are invited to just live your life, and for 2 hours you just you are brought in another time, in another location, and suddenly you share this time with other people. And I have the feeling that her photography is a bit that mm-hmm. she invites you to just live your contemporary life. It's nothing in her work that could be compared to what you have, and it wasn't the case even 20 years ago or 30 or 40 years ago. It was already completely different, because you have this feeling that you are back in the 1900s, even though maybe it wasn't at all that way, but it's a kind of, dream or fiction, or she imagines. So it's really more like kind of narrative mm-hmm. That she built. And this is very interesting in photography, because photography in the 20th century was a lot about documentary. This camera will show you the reality, and this is a way to show you, what was the places. You would travel the world and you would make photographs, and that would you share in magazines, or you would go to people and make a documentary story about these people. So that photography was really about that in the 20th century. Fashion was always fictional. But fashion is there also to make you believe that it's not a fiction but reality. So these beautiful people, that's their life and that's real. So it was a trick. But with Deborah's work, it has a complete different feeling. She doesn't try to bring you in a world that you think it's real. It's completely unreal. And in that sense, I think it's also very contemporary of, pushing for this narrative and working in photography like you would create a film. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think she was ahead of her time, because of course, if you think later about Peter Lindbergh, but he came much later, this is a bit, what you have as a feeling like being in a film sometimes. So for her, I think she pushes that also very clearly, and you don't know the characters, you don't know these people, and she doesn't tell you who they are and what they think. They are all a little bit strange, but it gives you a lot of space to imagine. And I could relate to that because it gives you this, it's an invitation, and as a reader, you can just, be in this world and imagine tons of stories. And these stories belong to you, and it's completely fine. So she just opened the door, and you are invited to get into this realm.
Well, this has been so wonderful to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.